There is a moment when you finally realize something uncomfortable. You have been explaining yourself for years. Why you needed space. Why you said no. Why you stopped answering. Why you changed. Why you are tired. Why you don't want to go. Why something hurt you. Why you no longer feel the same. And somehow, every explanation still feels incomplete. So you explain a little more. You choose different words. You add more details. You tell the whole story. You try to make your intentions impossible to misunderstand. But the strange thing is this. The more you explain yourself, the less free you begin to feel. Because somewhere along the way, explanation stops being communication. It becomes permission. You are no longer telling people who you are. You are asking them to approve your right to be that person. And this is where Carl Jung gives us a much deeper way of understanding the problem. In Jungian psychology, one of the central struggles of human development is the movement away from living according to the expectations of the outside world and toward a more authentic relationship with the self. That process is often associated with individuation, and one of the things that makes individuation so difficult is that most people spend years learning to become understandable to others before they ever learn to become honest with themselves. They learn what makes people comfortable, what makes parents proud, what makes friends stay, what makes partners happy, what makes society approve, and slowly, almost invisibly, they begin building a version of themselves that can survive inside other people's expectations. That version may be polite, responsible, helpful, easy to understand, easy to predict, but it may not be real. And when your identity becomes dependent on being understood, every disagreement begins to feel like a threat. Someone misunderstands you. You panic. Someone questions your decision. You immediately defend it. Someone doesn't like your boundary. You start explaining why you had to create it. Someone becomes disappointed. You feel responsible for fixing their interpretation of you. You don't simply say, "I don't want this." You say, "I don't want this because." Then you explain. Then you give another reason. Then another. Because somewhere inside you is the belief that a simple no is not enough. That a boundary needs a courtroom. That your emotions need evidence. That your choices need a defense. And that if the other person still doesn't understand, you must have failed. But what if you haven't failed? What if they simply don't agree? What if they never will? This is the question that changes everything. Because being understood and being accepted are not the same thing. And being accepted and being true to yourself are not the same thing either. A person who has spent years seeking external approval often believes that peace comes when everyone finally understands them. But that moment may never come. There will always be someone who thinks you're selfish. Someone who thinks you're too sensitive. Someone who thinks you've changed. Someone who preferred the old version of you. Someone who takes your silence personally. Someone who interprets your distance as arrogance. Someone who sees your boundaries as rejection. And if your inner stability depends on correcting every one of those interpretations, you will spend your life managing other people's perceptions. You will become exhausted without understanding why. Because you are doing psychological work that was never yours to do. You are trying to control the minds of people who are allowed to misunderstand you. And this is where the need to explain yourself becomes more than a habit. It becomes a way of abandoning yourself. Think about how often this happens in ordinary life. You're tired, but instead of saying you need rest, you construct an entire explanation. You don't want to attend something, so you invent reasons that sound acceptable. You disagree with someone, but before expressing your opinion, you soften it until it barely resembles what you actually think. You become hurt, but then you immediately search for reasons why you shouldn't be hurt. You say no, then feel guilty. You set a boundary, then apologize for having one. You leave a conversation, then spend hours wondering whether you should have explained yourself differently, and eventually you begin doing something even more dangerous. You stop asking, "What do I actually feel?" and start asking, "What can I say that will make this feeling acceptable?" That is a completely different question. The first one leads inward. The second one leads outward. And Jung's work repeatedly points toward the importance of developing a relationship with the deeper self rather than allowing the external world to become the ultimate authority over your inner life. This does not mean becoming cold. It does not mean becoming selfish. It does not mean refusing every conversation, and it certainly does not mean never taking responsibility. There are times when explanations are necessary. There are times when communication is an act of love. There are times when someone deserves an honest conversation. The problem is not explanation itself. The problem is compulsion. The feeling that you must explain yourself, or you will lose your worth, your safety, your belonging, or your right to be accepted. That is different. And most people don't notice the difference because the behavior is socially rewarded. The person who constantly explains themselves often looks considerate, mature, accommodating, reasonable. They are always trying to keep the peace, always trying to make things clear, always trying to prevent conflict. But underneath that apparent maturity, there may be fear. Fear of rejection, fear of being misunderstood, fear of disappointing someone, fear of becoming the villain in another person's story. So they keep explaining and explaining and explaining until they no longer know whether they are communicating or negotiating for permission to exist. This is especially powerful in people who grew up feeling that their inner experience was somehow wrong. A child says, "I'm sad," and hears, "You're overreacting." The child says, "I'm scared," and hears, "There's nothing to be afraid of." The child becomes angry and hears, "Stop being difficult." The child tries to express a need and discovers that the need itself becomes a problem. So the child adapts. They learn that feelings are safest when translated into something adults will accept. They learn to justify, to soften, to anticipate reactions, to explain, and eventually they become experts at reading everyone else's emotional state while remaining disconnected from their own. They know when someone is disappointed. They know when a room feels uncomfortable. They know when someone is losing interest. They know when someone is angry, but they don't always know what they themselves want. Because their attention has been trained outward, their nervous system became an observer of other people. Their identity became a response. Their self-image became a mirror. And this is one of the deepest traps of people-pleasing. You can become incredibly skilled at avoiding rejection while becoming incredibly bad at recognizing yourself. That is why stopping the habit can feel strangely uncomfortable. You would think silence would feel peaceful. At first, it often doesn't. At first, silence can feel terrifying. Because when you stop explaining, you suddenly hear all the questions you were previously trying to silence. What if they think I'm selfish? What if they leave? What if they misunderstand me? What if they hate the new version of me? What if I disappoint them? And beneath all of those questions is one deeper fear. What happens if I stop being the person they need me to be? This is where change begins. Not when you become indifferent, but when you become willing to tolerate being misunderstood. That is a psychological milestone, because a person who cannot tolerate being misunderstood will always be tempted to betray themselves for acceptance. They will reshape the truth, they will over-explain, they will apologize, they will make themselves smaller. Not because they are weak in some simple sense, but because belonging once became connected to self-abandonment, and breaking that connection takes courage. You have to discover that someone else's disappointment is not automatically your responsibility. Someone else's confusion does not automatically require a defense. Someone else's judgment does not automatically become your truth. And someone else's rejection does not prove that your decision was wrong. This is what inner authority begins to look like. You stop asking everyone else to confirm your reality. You begin asking yourself, is this right for me? Do I actually want this? Does this relationship reflect who I am becoming? Am I saying yes because I mean yes, or because I am afraid of what happens after no? Am I explaining this because communication requires it, or because I cannot tolerate someone being unhappy with me? That distinction can completely change your life. Because once you see it, you begin noticing how often you have been negotiating with people who were never in charge of your identity, and then something else happens. Your explanations become shorter, your boundaries become clearer, your decisions become quieter. You stop rehearsing conversations in your head. You stop trying to create the perfect argument. You stop rewriting messages 10 times so nobody can possibly misinterpret you. You stop feeling the need to defend every change in your life. You simply begin living it. And people may notice. Some will be confused. Some may become uncomfortable. Some may accuse you of changing. They are right. You did change. But that does not mean something went wrong. Sometimes the version of you that everyone loved was simply the version that required the least from them. The version that never said no. The version that always showed up. The version that swallowed disappointment. The version that explained every absence. The version that apologized for having needs. So when that version begins disappearing, people may call it selfishness. But sometimes what they are experiencing is the absence of your self-abandonment, and that feels very different. This is why the day you stop explaining yourself can become such a profound turning point. You are not becoming silent because you have nothing to say. You are becoming silent because you no longer need to turn your existence into an argument. There is a difference between silence as fear and silence as freedom. Fearful silence says, I am scared to speak. Inner silence says, I don't need to prove this. Fearful silence shrinks. Inner silence stands. Fearful silence waits for permission. Inner silence makes a decision. That is the transformation. And it does not happen overnight. You may still explain yourself sometimes. You may still feel the old impulse. Someone questions you, and your mind immediately starts building a defense. Notice that moment. Don't attack yourself for it. Just notice it. Ask, why do I feel like I need permission here? What am I afraid will happen if they disagree? What would I say if I knew I would not be judged? And sometimes the answer will surprise you. You may discover that what you really wanted was not to be understood. You wanted to avoid rejection. You wanted to prevent someone from being disappointed. You wanted to keep control of how they saw you. You wanted to remain the good one. And once you recognize that, the pattern loses some of its power because you can finally see what was hiding underneath the explanation. Fear, not weakness, not stupidity, not a lack of confidence. Fear. And fear becomes easier to work with when you stop disguising it as politeness. This is one of the reasons inner work matters. You cannot build a stable identity while continuously abandoning yourself to preserve someone else's comfort. At some point, you have to decide that your inner world deserves a voice even when nobody applauds it. You have to become willing to disappoint people. Not cruelly, not intentionally, but naturally. Because becoming yourself inevitably means becoming incompatible with some expectations. There will be people who only like you when you are convenient. People who understand you only when you agree with them. People who call your boundaries arrogance because they benefited from your lack of boundaries. And you cannot build an authentic life around avoiding their disappointment. At some point, you have to choose. Do you want to be understood by everyone? Or do you want to be at peace with yourself? Because you may not always get both. And this is where the deeper lesson becomes clear. The goal is not to stop explaining because explanations are bad. The goal is to stop explaining from fear. Speak when it is necessary. Clarify when it is meaningful. Apologize when you are genuinely wrong. Take responsibility when your actions hurt someone, but stop turning every personal decision into a petition for approval. You do not need a 5-minute speech to justify needing rest. You do not need a perfect argument to prove that a relationship no longer feels right. You do not need 10 reasons for saying no. You do not need to make someone agree with your boundary before you are allowed to have it. And you do not need to convince people that the person you are becoming is still worthy of their approval. The more deeply you know yourself, the less you need to constantly narrate yourself. That is the paradox. When you are disconnected from yourself, you talk endlessly about yourself. When you become more grounded in yourself, you need fewer explanations. Your actions speak. Your boundaries speak. Your choices speak. Your silence speaks. And perhaps the most powerful thing that happens when you stop explaining yourself is this. You finally have enough inner space to hear your own voice. Not the voice of your parents, not the voice of society, not the voice of the person who disappointed you, not the voice of the people who think they know who you should be. Yours. And maybe you discover that beneath all the explanations, there was a much simpler truth waiting for you. You were never asking for permission to speak. You were asking for permission to exist, and you don't need it anymore. The day you stop explaining yourself is not the day you stop caring. It is the day you stop abandoning yourself to prove that you are worthy of being cared about. That is the difference between isolation and individuation, between silence and suppression, between becoming cold and becoming whole. You don't need everyone to understand you. You need to understand yourself. And when you finally do, something becomes very quiet inside you. Not empty, not numb, quiet. Because, for the first time, you are no longer standing in front of your own life, defending your right to live it. You are simply living it.